برنامج ضوء النجيمات البعيدة بيستضيف مؤرخين وأكاديميين وكتاب متخصصين ومهتمين بموضوع العموم إفريقية. ضوء النجيمات البعيدة يأتيكم من القاهرة.
Hi James, thank you so much for agreeing to do this conversation with us. We really enjoyed reading your text about Radio Cairo and the way that Swahili directed programs were received and also had an influence, particularly in the Zanzibari context. Before I hand the moderation to Yahya, I maybe just start off with one question to you, and I would like to ask you to give us a bit of a more detailed picture of your work around Radio Cairo's early directed broadcast to East Africa in the 1950s.
They broadcast. They made the decision. That was majority Muslim language, which is an important point. To broadcast in Hausa, Somali, and Swahili, and they invited. At the same time, they were inviting political students and political actors. Often they were the same thing. They were students and sort of political actors to Egypt on scholarships. And many of the people there who were deemed talented or to have connections were given opportunities to serve as radio broadcasters because they knew the language, because they would speak Swahili or so. So I know the Swahili case fairly well. The Somali and Hausa case I don't know nearly as well. But that was the system. So that was a system of essentially creating a pipeline of student scholarships, political exiles, and having them settle in Cairo, and then using them as broadcast talent to project a kind of Nasserite vision of Pan-Africanism and anti-British, and to a certain extent anti-Israeli colonialism. That just kind of served as the sort of political function of the radio station, and it proved incredibly effective. In part because there were no other anti-colonial broadcasters, at least none with that direct a message, broadcasting to the areas of East Africa or the Horn of Africa or West Africa. Egypt, there were not Egypt. India had All India Radio, which was broadcasting, but not in such a political fashion. And of course, the main actors of the Soviet Union, China, they were very late to the idea of publishing in vernacular, broadcasting in vernacular language. They only started to do that around 1960 or 61. And they were also, they weren't as early and they weren't as effectively as Egypt was. And so Radio Cairo really carved out a dramatic space. And in the article that I published, it really talked also about the sort of politics on Zanzibar itself, not just changes in Egyptian policy, but Zanzibar politics are very complicated because the nationalist movement there was very pro-Egyptian, very radical, but it was perceived by the main opposition party in Zanzibar and elsewhere in East Africa as being a pro-Arab party, and a party that was did not, in the sort of propaganda of the day, did not have kind of the African interests at heart. It was rather, in their critical view, a way to maintain Arab privilege. So it's a very complicated politics, and that's kind of at the center of Zanzibari politics. But that, of course, ended up playing a very big role in how Radio Cairo's sort of policy, particularly regarding Zanzibar, shifted from the 1950s into the 1960s. So that's that part of the story, the political part of the story, I knew because that's my area of specialty. But the Egyptian part, I don't know. To this day, I still don't know very much about it. I know, and I was never able. I inquired about going to Cairo to see if there were any possible records there. I can read Arabic, but at a very basic level. And I was given enough sort of discouraging information that I'd never actually made the trip to Cairo for a research trip to get material on Radio Cairo. I was also fortunate enough to interview Ahmed Rashad long before I even knew he was a broadcaster. He was simply a person I was interviewing in the 1990s. And he, talked about his time a little bit as a radio broadcaster. But at the time I interviewed him, that wasn't my interest, unfortunately. And he passed away, unfortunately, before I really took interest in Radio Cairo as a topic to write about. There were other people who I was unable to catch who passed away. There was a guy named, his name is Solomon Malik, who was a Zanzibari who ended up working for the BBC Radio Swahili broadcasting service. But for some years, he was also a broadcaster at Sautia Cairo, which is Swahili for Radio Cairo. And I know about him through a guy who you may wish to contact. His name is Ahmed Rashad, and he is still alive, lives in London, and worked for BBC for several years. He's Zanzibari, and he was very young at the time, but he certainly has a number of clear memories about Radio Cairo. And he knew a lot of the people who had worked for Radio Cairo. And I only got to know him after I published my article, so I didn't actually use his information in my publications, but so that is essentially how that particular article came. My real, and I guess one of the main points of the article was that I was at the time interested in the origins of colonial broadcasting in East Africa. So each of the territories, Kenya, Zanzibar, Tanganyika, as it was called then, and Uganda, each established a radio broadcasting service during the Second World War, but then it kind of, after the war was over, it sort of went, it became less important. It was only really in the mid-1950s with Radio Cairo that there was serious funding given to all of the sort of colonial broadcasting stations. And it was done out of, political interest, that it was a service of counter-propaganda against Egypt. And that story, that the foundation of what is essentially the modern national broadcasting of these East African countries, was in many ways a direct late colonial response to Cairo broadcasting, I thought was very interesting. So it's a combination of those factors is what led me to write that article. I also wrote another article. It's called Sauti ya Mvita, which means Radio Mombasa. It's kind of a history of the radio station in Mombasa. It was published in an edited collection on media and religion. I can give you the reference to that as well. So those are the only two things I ended up really publishing on the topic. I had a lot more information, but I was unable to actually get access to the archives in Tanzania, which discouraged me from really continuing the radio research project for East Africa. And as I said, my Arabic language skills are too modest, and from what I heard, it seemed too difficult to really pursue this topic in Egypt itself. So I published those couple of things, and I'm happy with them, and I'm glad to see other people like them. But that really was the last seriously engaged with the topic. So that's kind of my story of how those articles came into being.
It's really like it's an amazing effort, to be honest. Like it's combining many things, like internal politics in Zanzibar and also what was happening like an Egyptian foreign policy. So the article itself gets some excerpts from Sawt al-Arab.
Yeah.
Like Zanzibar has this Arab-Afro tension, very obvious, which wasn't that obvious in other cases. And I think you also mentioned that the emphasis on Arab-Afro relation can be used in other broadcasters, but especially in the Swahili broadcast, they didn't really bring out a lot. Like, they didn't really talk about the Arab-Afro relation. However, at the same time, Sawt al-Arab was supporting the Nationalist Party because it was majorly Arab party. So I'm thinking, where is there contradiction at this moment between Sawt al-Arab editing policy and the Swahili or Ahmed Rashad kind of like work on the broadcast, because he wasn't really pro-Arab, he was pro-Afro-Shirazi?
Right. Well, he switched. I mean, he's among supporters of the Zanzibar Nationalist Party, which was, broadly speaking, sort of radical pro-Arab, for lack of a better term, pro-Arab party. He was initially a member of the ZNP, and then in Cairo, largely because of political pressures from the mainland African nationalist movements in Kenya, Tanganyika in particular. TANU ended up supporting the Afro-Shirazi Party very strongly by 1960 onwards. They didn't before that. Because of that basic political shift, Ahmed Rashad essentially changed sides is a little too strong, but he abandoned the Zanzibar Nationalist Party's kind of specific rhetoric and came to embrace, if not embrace the Afro-Shirazi Party, at least be more open to the idea that they were a legitimate political party, which was completely different from, say, his broadcast in 1957, 1958. So in a very short time, in the year 1960, he essentially, from the perspective of the Zanzibar Nationalist Party, he is a traitor. He's someone who left because of political circumstances. And it's connected, and I don't know nearly as much about this, but it's connected with the very difficult decision that the Cairo government, that the Egyptian government had to make, which was, do we continue to support the Zanzibar Nationalist Party, even though the majority of the much larger states on the mainland of East Africa are their opponents. And they tried to have it both ways for a certain time, and then by 1961-62 effectively give up that idea and become neutral. They still give scholarships to Zanzibar Nationalist Party people, but they become much more, I would say, distant than they had been 4 or 5 years earlier. So it's tied up very much with a kind of difficult diplomatic dilemma that the Egyptian government has to face, which is having embraced one political party on Zanzibar so closely at the beginning of in the mid 1950s, they had to adjust because that political party no longer had the support of the majority of the population on the mainland of East Africa, and it was clear from the elections were a minority party on Zanzibar itself. So that's my kind of explanation for that.
Yeah, but it appears that at the same moment that Sawt al-Arab was supporting the Nationalist Party, the Swahili broadcast was taking another drift.
Yeah. Well, that's I don't know. You're exactly right, and I think that's one of the interesting things about the broadcasting. It's I think I do say that in the article. It's not something that's completely controlled from on top. There's a surprising amount of autonomy given to these broadcasters. I think Ahmed Rashad was just very, very much a realist. But you're right, in Sawt al-Arab. And of course, the people who would be listening to Arab language broadcasts, obviously, those are not kind of mainland African listeners, right? Because vast majority of them would not understand Arabic. It would be people who understood Arabic language broadcasts would overwhelmingly be people who would continue to support the Zanzibar Nationalist Party. So part of it has to do with the language, but also part of it is, it's very interesting, has to do with, I think, a very sort of light editorial control that the state placed on the broadcasting. So particularly at that time when they are in a dilemma regarding East Africa.
Have you came to any resources that explains why there wasn't that tight grip on the editorial policy in such delicate matters?
No, I've not seen anything that stated it. That's simply my conclusion because you see similar things actually with the nationalist parties that open up offices in Cairo from Egypt, from Uganda, from Somalia. They are not given sort of marching orders from Nasser, from the Egyptian government at all. In fact, there's a lot of interesting splits and fights within those nationalist party offices in Cairo. That Nasser rarely intervenes, or the Egyptian government generally rarely intervenes in. So I don't know what the specific Egyptian policy was in many ways about it, besides in very broad terms. But just from reading evidence of East African actors, right, radio actors and also political actors, I was struck by how much freedom and space there was for what you would call dissident actors, even dissident actors within specific political parties, to still have a voice and to be able to recruit students to study in Cairo. I was impressed by how much freedom they had, which I translate as I use the term lack of editorial control for the radio broadcasting. I can't conclusively say anything about what this meant from the Egyptian perspective, only to say that they had far more freedom in Cairo than they did, for example, in a place like Moscow or Beijing, or some of these other places where a lot of students and political actors from East Africa go in the late 1950s, early 1960s.
Yani, are there any specific example you remember now about this kind of contrast between two liberation movement and at the same time the Egyptian authority just like giving up, not intervening?
Yeah, well, I guess one case has to do with the Kenyan party KANU, the Kenyan African National Union, who have offices in Egypt, but there's a big split within that party between Oginga Odinga, who is a major Kenyan ethnic Luo political actor, and people who would eventually support Jomo Kenyatta, who's an ethnically Kikuyu political actor. And there was a great deal of split within the KANU offices in Cairo in the early 1960s over who should actually run the office. One actor, Odinga, was very tightly aligned to the Eastern Bloc, to the Soviet Union. Jomo Kenyatta most definitely was not. But you could see kind of this is from intelligence files in the National Archives in London as well. You can see that at the office in Cairo that it's essentially whoever is running that office is able to set the policy, and then there would be, controversy about getting that person out of Cairo and replacing him with another actor who supports another faction. So it's that kind of, that's my evidence. My evidence is largely from the East African perspective. Much of it actually is British intelligence documentation, as well as some East African, sort of political letters and correspondence that I found that, like I say, very little of this has anything to do actually with the Egyptian government, unfortunately, because I never was able to access that or really have the skills and opportunity to use that kind of material.
So back to Cairo, there was another broadcast which was Voice of Free Africa, the secret one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where, like, I remember you were saying this was kind of like more aggressive one.
Yeah.
So was there any contradiction or between both of them, or it was just the editing policy kind of tone?
Well, I mean, my sense, it's been a while since I've looked at this. My sense of the Radio Free Africa was that it was the Egyptian government's, or I don't know who the actors are. Well, I shouldn't assume it's the Egyptian government. That it was the people involved in creating radio broadcast in Cairo. It was their effort to produce a broadcast that was more specifically Black African, that it was one that was less associated with Cairo, with the kind of Arab world in the way that Radio Cairo obviously was. And that's, as I recall, that's the case with this kind of music that they played. Even though there was a Swahili broadcast both on both that station as well as Radio Cairo. The emphasis was more on sort of mainland Black African politics, where discussions of Islam in particular play a much less prominent role. So that was my sense of what that meant.
So this is the race like issue always emerging with Tanzania. So at the moment of revolution and the massacre against like the Arab population in 1964, did you have any scripts from the broadcasts about this?
I do actually. I could dig them up. They are, I don't actually remember much of what it was. I mean, Radio Cairo by that point was, they were, as I recall, I'll have to look back. It's been a long time since I've thought about this, but as I recall, they were not particularly outraged by, certainly in the public radio broadcasting. They did not come to the defense of the Zanzibar. The massacre of January 1964 is usually seen correctly as an attack on the Zanzibar Nationalist Party. And as I recall, their broadcasts did not come to the defense of the Zanzibar Nationalist Party. I don't know that they certainly were not broadcasts that encouraged the actual violence, but they were broadcasts, again, that kind of tried to maintain that sort of neutrality, that desire to appeal to mainland Black African governments in East Africa. And as I said, which was kind of the policy really from around 1960 up until that revolution. So that is my sense. I will have to dig. It's been a long time since I have thought about that, though. So I would have to dig through the transcripts of the actual broadcast that came out of Cairo in January 64. But that's my impression. I'm pretty sure that's accurate, actually.
Because you also mentioned the response by the Arab broadcasts at this moment. I don't know if you mean Sawt al-Arab or as Arab.
Oh no, here I was talking about the Voice of Free Africa and the Swahili broadcast. Yeah, no, you're right. The South certainly the Arab language broadcast was highly critical of it. Yeah, there was a very profound split. And the Voice of Free Africa, as I said, was neutral. And did not support the ZNP. So you had, essentially it was a split along linguistic lines. The Arab language broadcasts were, appalled by the revolution. But again, they're broadcasting to a different population.
But from the same place.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. No, it's great. That's why I say the whole kind of thing is it's not an organized single policy that determines the broadcast. I mean, that was one of the main points of the article, which I think holds up. So. Also,
there is another point referring about Islam and like religion. So my question also about starting of all these video broadcasts, the major bulk of persons coming from Tanzania and other sub-Saharan Africa who happened to be in Cairo in 1954, I think they were basically Azhar students.
Yeah, almost all of them, yeah.
Yeah, because I think the other kind of students, the progressive, the liberal, or the leftist, they came after, like late 50s and then beginning of 60s. But the beginning were African students studying in al-Azhar. And I was just reading in Hilmi Sha'rawi book about how the first ever policy paper on Africa, like formed by Egyptian government, was focusing a lot on like Islamic missionaries spreading the rule of al-Azhar. So it was very kind of like Islamic lens to look at Africa and especially Tanzania. That's why they even tried to build like an Islamic center in Dar es Salaam, but they didn't succeed in this. So this shift from more pan-Islamic African policy, especially in 60s, I think you mentioned that Salah Salim he said like we are not supporting anything like any factions who are not Muslims. Did this kind of shift affected the radio wars or the perception of Radio Africa, or how it played in the Tanzanian politics at this moment?
Well, I would say initially the real attraction for Radio Cairo was that it was simultaneously anti-colonial, but also was rooted in kind of, esteemed Arab Islamic culture, which had attraction particularly for native Swahili-speaking peoples and obviously Arabic-speaking peoples along the coast in Zanzibar and in the coastal areas of East Africa. The reason, part of the reason you have this change toward a more secular programming, both in terms of radio as well as in terms of the nature of the students who they're gathering, the nature of kind of political refugees and political, party officers who set up offices in Cairo, that emerges in the late 50s, is that they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to accommodate this initial, in many ways quite strongly cultural anti-colonialism with one where the elements of Islam and the position of Egypt really, are for example, ethnic Luos or Kikuyu who are overwhelmingly Christian in central Kenya, that does not have nearly as important an attraction. Yes, they use the Swahili language, they share the language of Swahili, but it does not have the same cultural attraction that it does on the coastal areas of East Africa. So my sense of that change is they are simply trying to cope with these kind of cultural and political realities of a broader East Africa, who overall will numerically be controlled by essentially non-Muslims, except for Zanzibar. They're trying to sort of shift their broadcasting and their general kind of scholarship foreign policy outreach to accommodate that reality. And in the process of that, yes, you do have kind of the earlier, if you will, the earlier supporters and earlier actors of the world of Radio Cairo. They either have to adjust to that or they find themselves, ultimately, I think, on the losing end. Well, particularly in a place like Zanzibar, obviously, on the losing end of that transformation. So that's my view. It's Egypt's attempt to accommodate a much wider East African population who are interested in Swahili and English language broadcasting, but in broadly speaking, Muslims are a minority are a minority population in East Africa, except on the coast. So.
Yeah, but then it came back to be more pan-Islamic again. So it started pan-Islamic.
Yes. At the very end, they kind of get. Yeah, you're right. At the very end, again, that was Sautia, Cairo. There is a decision that's kind of made that. Well, I don't know. When I say a decision is made, I actually don't know who the actors are in any of this. So that's something I've never have been able to understand, because this is all secondhand, third-hand information in the article. I have no idea who makes policy decisions in Cairo about broadcasting. I just know the broadcasters. But you're right. Just towards the end, Radio Cairo sort of specifically, and actors within the Egyptian government do begin to kind of, or at least some of them, begin to identify with salvaging kind of the sort of pro-Arab, Islamic-oriented political actors and cultural actors, for that matter, in East Africa after the Zanzibar Revolution. You're right, that does happen, but I'm not sure how important that is. And then I guess the real important thing there is context. By 1964, Radio Cairo was less important, frankly, than it was in the 1950s and early 1960s, because after January 1964, you have a much stronger national broadcasting throughout East Africa, and you have a very dedicated and quite good vernacular language broadcasting coming from all over the world to East Africa, coming from Russia, from China, from the United States, from of course from BBC Britain. So Cairo no longer has kind of the anti-colonial monopoly by 1964 that it had in the mid-1950s. So I guess that's another transformation, and why you do get a sense that, well, perhaps our niche is to focus on kind of Islamic affairs. You're right, and I do mention that at the end of that article. So.
One of the things also grabbed my attention is like this kind of, as you say, like this radio wars, like the rise of national radio and the decline of this whole like Radio Africa thing. Was it kind of a sudden change because of one event, or was just a gradual change, or was the union between Zanzibar and Tanganyika kind of shifted the center from Zanzibar to Dar es Salaam and more like Black Africa rhetoric and discourse that Egypt didn't really was able to keep up with?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, Egypt found, well, of course, Egypt was much more invested in Congo, in terms of its actual investments. I would say by 1964, East Africa was one of the less important, foreign policy innovations that Egypt was pursuing. They're much more worried about what was happening in Eastern Congo. And of course, they were much more influential in Somalia and to a lesser extent in Northern Nigeria, in the Hausa broadcasting. So my sense is that East Africa becomes complicated. The union between Zanzibar and Tanganyika in many ways is designed to sort of minimize external interference in East African politics generally, from the United States, Soviet Union, down to including, actors like Egypt. So, it's one of the successes of that union is that it was deliberately created to minimize one foreign country's radio broadcast playing a big role in the political dialogue of the country. In fact, that's something that the early 1964 Tanzanian radio broadcasts emphasized. To turn off, listen to our radio broadcasts, don't listen to foreign radio broadcasts because they're trying to mislead you. And that applied across the board, right? It was not just against American or British broadcasts; it was all foreign broadcasts.
So the major person behind the African Association, which was in Zamalek, in this neighborhood in Cairo, where all these African liberation movements had their offices, he was called Professor Abdelaziz Ishaq, and he is the one who started all of this in 1955, and then got support from Nasser and Mohamed Fay. He was like Nasser man in Africa. He died, I think, in 70s. But his daughter is alive, and she is kind of like the source about his life and his involvement. So, like in Cairo, people are alive. They might be welcoming to talk if we had the right way to them. But archives are like a dead end, and I'm sure you have a bit of a sense about like a closed archive. It's not like Q. Like I spent a couple of months in Q doing my thesis, and nobody ever asked me any question except for my proof of address. In Egypt, it might like bring more troubles than just like close the archive. We avoid even applying, to be honest.
Oh, really? Oh, it's that bad. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of like puts you under the light and.
Right. Oh, geez, that's too bad. Yeah.
Of course, this is even a more sensitive archive we're talking about now, but we're having the same, even if we're looking at films from directors from the 70s that we know are in the National Cinema Archive, we don't get access to it. Like we sometimes spend months of writing letters and calling people, and in the end we get a very bad copy from the cousin of the filmmaker. But
right.
But there is also something to speak for that. That's just the reality we meet here now. So this like going to the family members or the relatives of the people who were involved, and like this, like it's just how we can move now. So that's what we have to work with to some degree.
I'm mesmerized by the sources in the article, and it's the first time I came to know that there is something called BBC Summary of World Broadcasts, and I think it is the only source on earth now which has this information, like exhibits from the real broadcasting that was happening at this moment.
It's a very rich source.
So it's basically in Reading.
Yeah. It's in Reading. Well, so there's two. Well, there's one that is published, right? So the monitoring service, you can get that. Several. I think it's been parts of it have actually been digitalized. I believe at least after 1979, not before 1979. But in terms of the correspondence, you have to apply. They are open, I think, 3 days a week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You have to apply in advance, but it's really incredibly rich archive. The written archives. I've never had any luck getting access to actually BBC audio or visual archives. That's a whole different thing, and they're much more protective of that. But the written archives are a wonderful place to work, and very easy place to work. It's in a place called Caversham, which is just north of Reading. It's where the headquarters of the BBC monitoring service is located.
I asked a friend of mine to go. Like there might be one of these files in Cambridge University. When he went to it and he took some photos, it's very kind of points, not transcripts.
Well, that is the problem. Unless it's a very important file, they don't actually save to my knowledge, the printed transcripts, or in many cases even the tapes of the actual radio broadcast. They simply produce, what was important for British policymakers. So it's overwhelmingly focused on the Cold War and on security issues. They simply translate what is relevant to that concern. And you almost never find the original language, which is very frustrating. You can only read English language translations. And then it's usually edited for what they think the policymakers would be interested in. So, it's a lens that unfortunately leaves all kinds of elements out. So you have indexes, and then you also have you have a kind of editorial process where largely it is focused on political broadcasts, but also on economic broadcasts, on media broadcasts that tell you something about what is happening with the economy or the media or the trade relationships of the country from radio broadcasts. And these radio broadcasts can come from anywhere, right? They can come from the countries themselves. They can come from Egypt. They can come from the Soviet Union, the United States. They're just essentially keeping track of all the radio broadcasts and then trying to index them to make open source information relevant for policymakers. That's the purpose of the BBC Summary of World Broadcasts.
So how come in the article, like, there are like a huge paragraph that you quote?
Yeah, oh, sometimes there are. Yeah, no, for political broadcasts, especially early on when Radio Cairo was new, they would quote it at length. And they would quote it at length. They would use it in diplomatic complaints they'd present to the Egyptian government. That's why they quoted at length. It was for legal purposes. So it depends on the situation, right? If it's something new and interesting and politically very important, you will get very long transcriptions of broadcasts. When it comes to, by 1963, 1964, it's not seen as important. And when you do actually get, broadcast transcriptions, they'll be much shorter because they're just not seen as a political threat. So essentially the way it works is the larger the political threat, the longer the transcription of the radio broadcast.
Thanks a lot, James. It was really nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your generosity.
Oh, my
very
pleasure.
much. Yes, very much so.